Imagine, like, running for your life as your entire village just burns to the ground.
Oh, yeah. Total nightmare scenario.
Right. You are coughing on this thick, oily ash. The screams of your family, your neighbors, they're echoing in the distance, just getting completely swallowed by the roar of the flames.
It's such a visceral opening.
It really is. And in the dead of night, you know, trembling, completely covered in soot, you are shoved into the hands of a smuggler. Your entire life, your identity, your history, it has just been erased in a single night of fire.
Yeah. And the craziest part is the secret you're carrying.
Exactly. As you grow up in hiding, you harbor this terrifying, deadly secret. And it's literally written right on your face.
It's inescapable.
Totally.
Right.
Because if anyone, like literally anyone, sees the true, shimmering silver color of your eyes, kings will wage brutal, bloody wars just to capture you.
You wouldn't even be a person anymore.
No, you would be property. You'd be a weapon.
It is a phenomenal, just incredibly visceral image to start with, and it immediately sets the stakes for the universe we are exploring today. I mean, the cost of existence in this world is incredibly high, and it is almost always paid in flesh.
Absolutely. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Today we are digging into L.J. Andrews' Broken Souls and Bones, and I gotta say, magic in this book isn't about waving wands or muttering incantations in some dusty old tower.
No, not at all. It's so much darker than that.
It is a biological arms race. The magic here is anatomical, it is visceral, and it is deeply, deeply painful. So today we are charting exactly how flesh, blood, and fractured souls are weaponized in this world.
We are unpacking a really complex landscape here. You've got political betrayal, biological manipulation, and this dark fantasy romance that is fundamentally built on the psychological and literal concept of a split soul.
Yeah, that split soul concept is wild. We'll definitely get into that. But what makes this text so endlessly fascinating to dissect, at least for me, is that the author never shies away from the grotesque consequences of power.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, completely. The continent of Stigandra is basically a blood-soaked chessboard. And right at the center of this board, we have the inevitable, violently combustible collision of our two main characters.
The collision we've all been waiting for.
Right. So on one side, we have Lyra Bien. She is the hidden melder. She's the girl with those silver-scarred eyes who has been living in deep disguise for years.
Just absolutely terrified of her own latent genetic abilities.
Exactly. And on the other side of that collision is Roark Ashwood. And he is an incredibly intimidating presence right from the second he walks onto the page.
Oh man, Roark. He's not your typical knight in shining armor, that's for sure.
Not even close.
Oh.
He is a sentry, which is an elite royal guard, but he is a draven by blood. And he's entirely mute.
With this massive, horrific scar.
Yeah, it's carved completely across his chest, severing his throat and ending at the hinge of his jaw. So he speaks rapidly through these complex hand gestures.
And when the environment demands silence, he communicates through direct skin-to-skin touch, which we're definitely going to talk about the implications of that later.
Heck, we have to. It's so intense. But yeah, he is ruthless. He is heavily scarred, both physically and mentally. And his autonomy is completely compromised.
Because he's bound by that magical fealty bone.
Exactly. He's bound to the prince he serves. Which means when Lyra and Roark finally cross paths, it is not your standard meet cute.
No, it's really not. It is the intersection of two people who have been entirely commodified by the world around them.
But to fully grasp why their collision is so explosive and why Lyra's silver eyes are essentially a walking death sentence, or a crown, depending entirely on who manages to put her in chains, we have to look at the anatomy of craft in this world.
Right, the magic system. Let's lay the geography and the genetics out for you, the listener, because understanding this map is crucial to understanding the horror of the politics.
It really is. The world building is meticulously structured around 3 distinct kingdoms, and each kingdom is inherently tied to a specific hereditary type of magical genetics.
Okay, so first, in the west, you have Dravenmoor. This is wild, untamed territory, right? It's isolated by these massive, treacherous ravines. It's harsh, and the people reflect that landscape.
Yeah, they are survivors.
Then you have Murda. This is your coastal kingdom, heavily reliant on the sea. They are known for their strategic alliances and expansive trade routes.
The politicians and the merchants.
Exactly. And finally, the kingdom where a massive portion of our narrative unfolds, Jorvandel. This is the seat of absolute power. Specifically, you've got the towering, impenetrable fortress of Stonegate.
Which is ruled with an absolute iron fist by the ruthless King Demir.
Right. So the political tension pulling these three kingdoms toward war, it isn't about land disputes or typical resources like gold or iron, is it?
No, it's entirely dictated by the three crafts. This is the magic system explicitly outlined in the text, and the defining characteristic of this magic is that it is strictly biological.
It's all about bodies.
Exactly. It is the direct manipulation of bodily mediums. So in Jorvindal, the genetic currency is bonecraft. These crafters have the terrifying ability to manipulate calcium to bend living and dead bone to their will.
The mechanics of bonecraft are pure body horror. I mean, they aren't just making like cool armor out of animal bones.
No, no, no. A skilled Jorvin bone crafter can take a living person, tap into the magic, and literally snap and splinter the bones inside that person's body without ever breaking the skin.
Ugh, yeah. They can fashion dead bone into unbreakable blades, sure, but their primary weapon is the skeleton of their enemy. Just reading the descriptions of how they inflict pain made me physically wince.
It is a devastating offensive capability.
It really is.
Then, looking to the coast in Murda, you have Bloodcraft. Mechanically, this functions a bit closer to what you might expect in a dark fantasy setting.
Like spellcasting.
Yeah, spellcasting, tracking people across vast distances, using the iron and essence in blood combined with intricate runes to bind magical contracts. It is the magic of surveillance and binding.
Okay, and finally, originating in Dravenmore, where Roark hails from, you have Soulcraft.
And Soulcraft is arguably the bleakest of the three.
Oh, for sure. It isn't just speaking to ghosts, right? It is drawing raw, kinetic power from the dead.
It is manipulating the literal essence of fallen souls. It treats human consciousness post-mortem as an extractable resource.
That is so dark. And the foundational mythology behind how these three distinct biological crafts came into existence is incredibly grim. Like, it tells us everything we need to know about the morality of this continent.
Oh, yeah. The lore centers on the first king, known as the Wanderer King. According to the histories, he rescued a daughter of the gods, a god queen.
And as a reward for this act, he was gifted pieces of these three divine mediums: bone, blood, and soul.
But the Wanderer King wasn't satisfied with just a piece of the pie. The lore establishes that he was completely consumed by this insatiable greed.
Right. He didn't just want to be a powerful mortal. He wanted to master all three crafts simultaneously. He wanted to ascend to godhood himself.
And his god queen wife, recognizing the extreme danger of consolidating that much power in a mortal vessel, absolutely refused to teach him her highborn magic.
Good for her. But, and this is where it gets awful, his response to her refusal wasn't negotiation.
No, it was an act of profound, calculated domestic terrorism.
He sneaked into the chambers of his own children, his own blood heirs, and he poisoned them.
He left them thrashing in agony, hovering on the absolute brink of death, and then he held the antidote hostage.
Unbelievable. He looked his god queen wife in the eye and told her he would only administer the cure and save their kids if she taught him how to bridge the three crafts.
I'm so glad you emphasized the domestic terrorism aspect of this because it is crucial.
Yeah, I was reading this origin story and thinking, like, this isn't a myth about a hero stealing fire from the gods to help humanity. This is a story about a father torturing his own children to extort his wife.
It establishes from page 1 that the very foundation of magic in this world is rooted in the ruthless sacrifice of innocence.
Power here isn't earned through wisdom. It is stolen through betrayal.
It permanently taints the concept of magic. In her absolute desperation to save her children, the God Queen surrendered. She taught the Wanderer King the biological mechanics of the magic.
She taught him how to mark dead bones with blood runes, right?
Yeah, and how to use soulcraft to bridge the dead medium into a living vessel. And that horrific extortion birthed the genetic anomaly that drives our entire plot.
The melder?
The melder. This is the genetic jackpot, and it happens to be Lyra.
A melder is wildly rare. The text suggests they are born perhaps only once a generation, and it is exceedingly rare for the trait to present in a female bloodline.
A melder is the only human being with the genetic capability to bridge all three crafts.
So mechanically, how does that work? Like a biological conduit?
Exactly. They can take a piece of dead bone, which has been intricately marked with Myrden blood runes, and using Draven soulcraft, they can meld that dead matter seamlessly into a living human body.
That's intense.
They combine the raw physical defense of Jorvindal, the binding magic of Murda, and the ethereal power of Dravenmore into one unified, horrifyingly powerful process. They are the ultimate weapon in this world.
I kept thinking about this setup like an extreme biological nuclear arms race.
Right.
Like Look at someone like King Demir of Jorvandal.
Right.
He isn't stockpiling bronze swords, catapults, or grain for a siege. He is stockpiling magical genetics. He is hoarding human bloodlines.
Yes.
And my immediate reaction, looking at the history of this magic, knowing it was born from a father poisoning his own kids, is to ask, why on earth does anyone in this society view these abilities as anything other than a devastating radioactive curse? Like, why pursue it?
Well, because the logic of deterrence in an arms race strips away all morality. It doesn't matter if you view the weapon as an ethical abomination.
Right, if your neighbor has it.
Exactly. If you recognize that the weapon is a curse, but your neighbor is actively trying to acquire the launch codes, you are forced to acquire them first just to ensure your own survival. Mutually assured destruction operates on fear, not ethics.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
King Demir is operating from a place of intense paranoia and desperation.
He knows that if Dravenmore or Myrda manage to locate and control the melder, his kingdom of Jorvandal will be obliterated.
This absolute desperation to win the biological arms race is what initiates the brutal, continent-wide manhunt that inevitably forces Lyra and Roark to collide.
And that collision doesn't start with a subtle clue. It kicks off with a gruesome, incredibly loud declaration of war.
Yeah, we are inside Stonegate, the supposedly impenetrable Jorvan fortress, and a young Stavgard named Uther is found murdered.
And we have to be clear about the forensics here because it highlights the brutality of the magic.
Okay, lay it out.
Uther is found face down in the river, but he didn't drown. His chest has been completely flayed open. The text describes his ribs as being torn apart from the inside, cracked open like an eggshell to expose his vital organs.
Oh, that is horrible. And because Uther was a bone crafter, the immediate panicked assumption within the fortress is that Dravenmore assassins have breached the walls.
Uther's murder is the catalyst that shatters the fragile political stalemate. It is a siren blaring in King Demir's ear, alerting him that his enemies are making aggressive, localized moves. And
in the ensuing investigation, Demir utilizes his Myrden bloodcrafters to trace the magical residue, right?
Yes, and that leads to a terrifying discovery. A rogue bloodcrafter living in a distant, obscure village managed to intercept the king's magical tracking spells.
Whoa.
This traitor sold the location of a lost melder to Dravenmore scouts.
So the melder, who everyone assumed had perished in the bloody raids years prior, is alive. The ghost has a pulse, and the Draven are closing in on her.
Which means Demir has to act instantly, and this is where Roark Ashwood, the sentry, is deployed like a ballistic missile.
Let's delve into the mechanics of Roark's servitude for a second, because he isn't just a loyal soldier following orders out of patriotism, right?
No, not at all. He is a Draven by blood, serving the Dwarven king, which already places him in a highly precarious, alienated social position.
Right. And he is bound to the Jorvan Prince Thane by something called a fealty bone.
Yes.
How does this actually work? We know it's a sliver of bone, but it completely strips him of his autonomy.
The fealty bone is one of the most insidious applications of bonecraft we see in the text. It isn't a magical oath spoken in a throne room. It is a physical, biological tether.
Like actually inside him.
A sliver of enchanted bone is literally melded into the nervous systems of both the servant Roark and the master Prince Thane. It acts as a biological override switch.
That is horrifying.
It forces a connection that is virtually impossible to break without severing the spinal cord and killing the host. It ensures absolute physical loyalty. Roark cannot disobey a direct command from his master without his own biology turning against him in paralyzing agony.
So when Prince Thane orders Roark to travel to the quiet coastal village of Skalfirth to extract this hidden melder before the Dravenmore scouts can claim her, Roark has literally no choice but to deploy.
Exactly. He's a weapon being pointed at a target.
And while Roark is marching towards Skalfirth with a detachment of heavily armed staff guards, we see Lyra, who's been hiding in this village in plain sight for years.
Her survival strategy is brutal in its simplicity, but the physical cost is agonizing.
Tell me about the eye dye, because I was wincing through this whole part.
Right. To mask her genetic identity, she uses a substance called thorn blossom dye. Every single day, she drops this dye directly into her eyes to change her brilliant, telltale silver irises into a dark, unremarkable violet.
But the text makes it very clear. This isn't like popping in colored contact lenses in the morning. Dropping thorn blossoms in your eyes burns like hot ash being tossed directly onto your corneas.
That detail is vital because it physicalizes the trauma of her childhood. Lyra was so young when her village was raided that she barely possesses conscious memories of the night the flames took her family.
But her body remembers.
her body remembers. The necessity of hiding is so deeply ingrained in her psyche that she is willing to subject herself to localized, excruciating torture every single morning just to maintain the facade. The burning of the die is a daily sensory reminder that the world wants her dead.
But the facade is about to crumble. Roark arrives in Scalfirth, bringing with him a Draven bone crafter named Emmy Nightlark, who we learned is actually Roark's cousin.
And they assemble the villagers in the local hall. They know the melder's in the room, but because of Lyra's daily torture with the die, they don't know who it is.
And the method Roark and Emmy use to force the melder out of hiding is absolutely chilling. It completely upends everything you expect from the protector archetype in fantasy.
This is where the author really forces the reader to confront the morality of utilitarianism in a grim, dark setting.
Okay, so Lyra has an adoptive brother, Kael Darquin. Kael is technically a disowned noble from a very powerful Jorvan house, but to Lyra, he is simply the family she has left.
Right. And Roark and Emmy calculate that the only foolproof way to force a melder to reveal their identity is to create a scenario where their inherent biological urge to heal overrides their instinct for self-preservation.
They have to create a mortal wound that only a melder can fix.
And they don't just, threaten Kael with a sword. That would be too conventional.
No. Emmy, operating under Roark's silent command, steps up to Kael, places her hands flat against his chest, quietly apologizes to him, and uses her bone craft.
The hall just fills with the sickening, wet sound of human bone cracking and splintering. Emmy literally snaps Kael's ribs inside his chest cavity, driving the jagged bone fragments directly into his internal organs.
The protectors become the torturers. They commit an act of sheer, unadulterated violence on a completely innocent man.
It is a calculated psychological strike. Roark stands there in the echoing hall, cold, stoic, holding out a piece of dead bone wrapped in cloth.
He is basically daring anyone in the room to step forward and save Kael's life as he bleeds out internally.
Roark knows the psychology of a healer. He knows that someone whose very genetic code is built around bridging and mending life will not be able to stand idly by and watch someone they love drown in their own blood if they have the power to stop it.
It's an agonizing scene because the trap works perfectly. Lyra's emotional bond to Kael completely shatters her self-preservation. She is forced to step out of the crowd.
She snatches the dead bone from Roark's hand.
But here is the critical pivot of the narrative. In activating this latent magic to save her brother, Lyra doesn't just perform a miraculous healing, she rips open a door to a deeply terrifying psychological and spiritual landscape.
To appreciate the weight of this moment, we really have to examine the explicit mechanics of the melding process. The author makes this magic incredibly tactile.
Right. When Lyra takes this soul bone, which again is a piece of dead bone deeply inscribed with Myrden blood runes, and presses it forcefully into Kael's bleeding flesh, she experiences a sensory shift.
The text describes her seeing these chaotic, glowing golden filaments erupting from the bone.
I love this description because it frames the magic as a brutal form of surgery. Lyra's fingers act as invisible needles. She has to physically trace these glowing golden threads, grasping them, pulling them down, essentially stitching the dead bone into the living tissue.
She's forcing the two mediums to fuse together. And what's fascinating is that no one else in the room can see these golden threads. To Roark, Emmy, and the villagers, she is just holding a bone against Kael's chest.
Right. The golden filaments are a vision exclusive to the genetic architecture of the melder.
But as she performs this intricate, invisible surgery, her consciousness is violently pulled away from the physical reality of the village hall. She descends into a psychological state that the lore calls the melder's trance.
The bright candlelit room fades away, the ambient noise of the villagers vanishes, and the temperature plummets.
She finds herself standing in a dark, ashy, shadowy reflection of the real world. This is the Mirrorland.
The Mirrorland. This is such a brilliant conceptual space. It's like an upside-down world where the cost of magic is made geographically real.
And in this freezing, shadowy realm, she isn't alone. She encounters a phantom.
Skuldrick.
Yes. This terrifying specter named Skuldrick materializes. He is cloaked in living shadows, he has these piercing, burning red eyes, and he doesn't greet her.
No. He immediately establishes the absolute, unbreakable, cosmic rule of her genetics. He looks at her and tells her the fundamental law of the universe. A soul for a soul.
This is the thermodynamics of magic in Stigandra. You cannot create life or energy from nothing. You can only exchange it.
Skuldrek explains the ledger, right?
Exactly. If Lyra reaches into the Mirrorland and takes the strength of a dead soul from its rest in order to heal or armor a living body in the real world, the cosmic balance is disrupted.
So, to maintain that equilibrium, Skuldrek will emerge into the real world and take a living soul to replace the one she borrowed.
It is a zero-sum game of life and death.
And this chilling cosmic ledger is exactly why King Dimir is so dangerously obsessed with capturing her. He isn't interested in the melder because he wants to build a hospital and heal the sick.
No, King Dimir wants to build an unstoppable army. He intends to use Lyra as an assembly line worker.
He wants her to meld soul bones, specifically bones harvested from legendary, incredibly violent fallen warriors, directly into his elite staff guards.
This process physically grants the living guards the indestructible power, the stamina, and the literal bone armor of those dead warriors. He is mutating his men into what the text calls berserkers.
Which reframes the entire conflict. Dimir's trying to cheat the cosmic ledger. He wants the power of the dead without paying the toll.
But Skuldrek's rule is absolute.
Right, and this raises a massive critical question that I wrestled with while reading. Let me throw an analogy out here.
Sure.
The melding process feels to me like a grotesque organ transplant.
Okay.
But the organ you receive comes with the vengeful ghost of the donor permanently attached to it.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Lyra constantly internalizes her actions, telling herself, I have to do this. I'm melding these bones into Dimir's soldiers to keep Kael safe, to keep the people I love alive. But if Skuldrek's rule is absolute, that every single time she successfully melds a bone, this shadowy phantom is unleashed into the real world to murder someone, to balance the scales. Isn't Lyra just laundering the violence?
Yeah.
Isn't she essentially transferring the murder from her own family onto complete, innocent strangers?
That is the central, agonizing moral dilemma that defines Lyra's character arc.
Yeah.
You are absolutely right. She is trapped in a perpetual, unwinnable trolley problem.
It's awful.
And the horrific part is that King Dimir is the one forcing her hand onto the lever every single day. If she heals her brother, a villager somewhere dies in the night.
If she armors a royal guard to appease the king and buy Kael another day of safety, somewhere in the kingdom, an innocent person is slaughtered by Skuldrek's shadow forces.
She is fully aware of the mathematics of her survival.
The psychological burden of that must be crushing. It entirely isolates her. I mean, she is physically surrounded by hundreds of people in the bustling fortress of Stonegate, but she is entirely alone in her guilt.
She can't talk to Kael about it.
Because how do you look at your brother and say, hey, your beating heart cost the life of a child 3 villages over?
Exactly. Her guilt builds an impenetrable wall around her, which leads to one of the most compelling ironies of the narrative.
This immense, isolating guilt pushes her, against all logic, to the only person in Stonegate who actually seems to comprehend the physical, emotional, and spiritual weight of living a cursed existence.
It pushes her toward her captor, the man who orchestrated her brother's torture, Roark Ashwood.
Let's transition into this relationship because the development of their dynamic is entirely rooted in the shared isolation. And Andrews introduces one of the most unique, intense methods of building a relationship I've read in a long time.
Tactile communication.
Yes. As we established, Roark is mute. His vocal cords were severed by that massive scar. So, for everyday logistics, he relies on rapid, complex hand gestures.
But the text explicitly notes a rule for interacting with Roark. To understand him, you have to grant him your full attention.
You have to look directly at his hands, you cannot turn your back on him, and you cannot multitask.
It demands an intense level of focus, which in a court built on whispers, espionage, and looking over your shoulder, is a very dangerous vulnerability. Roark's silence isolates him just as much as Lyra's guilt isolates her.
But the dynamic shifts dramatically when the environment changes.
Right. When things get intimate, or when they are surrounded by Dimir's spies and need to communicate secretively without broad gestures that anyone could interpret, Roark changes his method.
He doesn't use the standard signs. He speaks by taking his bare fingers and physically tracing the letters and words directly onto Lyra's skin.
He spells out his thoughts on the curve of her cheek, across the center of her palm, or along the line of her collarbone.
If we look closely at the mechanics of this, it is a brilliant narrative device because it forces a profound, unavoidable physical intimacy.
Think about a typical dialogue in a novel. Characters can be shouting across a courtyard, they can be staring at the floor, actively avoiding eye contact, while discussing deep emotional wounds.
But for Roark to communicate a secret to Lyra, he has to close the physical distance. He has to reach out and touch her.
Every single private conversation between them ceases to be just an exchange of information. It becomes a highly charged, tactile experience. He isn't just speaking to her ears. His words are literally sinking into her pores.
I kept thinking about the anxiety and the vulnerability of that. Like Lyra's a prisoner, hyper-aware of the violence men like Roark are capable of.
Yet to hear what he has to say, she has to hold perfectly still and allow this massive, scarred weapon of a man to trace his fingers over her throat.
The physiological response the author describes, the involuntary goosebumps, the sudden spike in her pulse, the heat of his skin against hers, it entirely blurs the line between functional communication and a romantic caress.
It is incredibly intimate. And that physical bond of communication rapidly translates into a fiercely protective dynamic.
Roark isn't just a warden. He begins to act as a physical barrier between Lyra and the casual brutality of Stonegate. This is showcased perfectly in a highly tense sequence in the corridors of the fortress.
Yes, the tavern assault. Lyra is trying to navigate the halls, and she is cornered by this arrogant, utterly reprehensible, Jorvan noble, Sir Thomas.
He physically assaults her, pinning her roughly against the stone wall.
Yeah.
And he isn't just bullying her. He explicitly threatens to assault her with the intent of forcing her to bear his heir.
Because he calculates that if she is pregnant with his child, King Demir won't be able to use her in the dangerous melding rituals. He is trying to claim her genetics through sexual violence.
It is a terrifying moment of complete vulnerability, reinforcing that to men like Thomas, Lyra isn't a human being. She is an incubator for magical traits. But what makes this scene crucial is that Lyra does not wait for a savior.
No, in a moment of pure panic and visceral self-defense, she weaponizes her melding magic aggressively for the first time.
She doesn't have a soul bone to use, so she uses the raw craft. She manages to get her hand on Thomas's face, accesses the genetic magic within her, and she literally melds his upper and lower jaw together.
She fuses the living teeth and the bone of his jaw into one solid, immovable block of calcium.
He can't speak, he can't bite, he can't even scream properly. It is an incredibly dark, badass moment of reclaiming her bodily autonomy.
And then Roark arrives.
Right. And in a lot of traditional fantasy, this is the moment the big, strong guard would shove the heroine aside, draw his sword, and kill the assailant to defend her honor.
But Roark doesn't usurp her agency. He assesses the situation, sees that Lyra has neutralized the immediate threat, and instead of taking over, he supports her action.
He physically restrains Thomas, pinning him against the stairs, and he communicates to Lyra that Thomas needs a permanent, physical reminder of the consequences of touching her.
Roark calmly, almost clinically, takes his knife and slices off the tip of Tomas's finger.
He amputates the finger Tomas used to touch her. It is such a dark, brutal form of validation.
Roark is looking at what she did, this horrifying fusion of a man's jaw, and essentially saying, good, now let's make sure he remembers it.
He isn't undermining her power. He is reinforcing her boundary with absolute synchronized violence. This intense, almost feral protectiveness introduces us to a core piece of cultural lore in the text that attempts to explain their connection.
The concept of Stjeleven.
Yes, Stjeleven. It is a Draven term that translates roughly to the myth of bonded souls. There is a specific fable told in the marketplaces of Stenandria that perfectly mirrors Lyra's internal conflict regarding Roark.
The myth tells of a beautiful nymph who is torn between two lovers. One lover is kind, gentle, and represents absolute safety. The other lover is incredibly strong, cunning, and fundamentally wicked.
The nymph is paralyzed by indecision, so the goddess of love intervenes. But the goddess doesn't choose for her. Instead, she combines the two men into a single entity.
The moral framework of the Stjeleven myth argues that to truly love someone, you cannot just love their light, safe, polished pieces. You must fully accept and embrace their darkest, most wicked edges.
Okay, I have to push back hard here because when I read that myth, alarm bells went off in my head.
Oh, really?
Yeah. As a reader analyzing this relationship, you have to ask the uncomfortable question. Is this genuine, earned romance? Or is this the ultimate textbook case of trauma bonding?
That's a fair question.
Let's look at the facts. Lyra is literally a political hostage. She's entirely isolated in a hostile fortress. And she is falling in love with the warden who dragged her from her home, the man who stood by and facilitated the brutal torture of her brother just weeks prior.
Right.
I struggle to see how a magical soul bond absolves Roark of being her jailer. Is this actually love? Or is it just a psychological survival tactic of a desperate prisoner?
It is a profoundly valid critique, and it is the exact tension that places this book firmly and unapologetically within the dark romance genre.
Okay, the genre context.
Yeah. If you view the relationship through the lens of modern, real-world psychology, it absolutely reads as a trauma response akin to Stockholm Syndrome. However, within the established framework of this dark fantasy setting, the text argues for a different interpretation.
How so?
The appeal of dark romance often lies in the exploration of the taboo, in the fantasy of the heroine finding absolute safety within the monster rather than fleeing from it.
So you're saying the brutality is a feature, not a bug.
Precisely. Roark is undeniably brutal. He sliced a man's finger off without a second thought. But the narrative argues that in a world ruled by men like King Demir, Roark's specific brand of brutality is the exact and only tool set capable of ensuring Lyra's survival.
So the safe lover from this Jalevan myth would be slaughtered in Stonegate in a day.
Exactly. The Jalevan concept implies that their connection transcends typical psychological conditioning. It suggests a literal, magical intertwining of their souls that recognizes they are two halves of the same scarred coin.
I see the genre distinction. It's about accepting the monster, because the monster is the only thing standing between you and the wolves.
Right.
But here is where Andrews pulls the rug out from under the reader. The concept of the monster isn't just a poetic metaphor for Roark's brooding personality or his violent skill set.
Not at all. As the political tension in Stonegate finally reaches its boiling point, Lyra discovers that the literal monster haunting her magic and the man she is falling in love with are horrifyingly biologically connected.
This realization coincides with the explosive climax of the political plot. Stonegate, for centuries, has been touted as an impenetrable fortress, but walls are only as strong as the people guarding the gates.
Traitors within the Jorvan military unlock the massive iron gates from the inside under the cover of darkness. They allow a horde of Ravager's enemy forces to flood directly into the inner courtyards.
The result is absolute immediate chaos. The fortress is burning. During the frantic battle, Lyra is desperately trying to navigate the courtyard to escape, and in the panic, she accidentally slips into the Mirrorland.
She drops into the freezing, ashy melder's trance.
And from this vantage point, she sees that King Demir's grand strategy, his biological arms race, has gone horribly, catastrophically wrong.
One of his elite berserker guards, whose mind has been completely corrupted by the violent soul bones stitched into his flesh, has gone rogue.
The dead soul has taken over the living host. And this corrupted berserker is about to murder a little boy, Christian, who is cowering in the rubble.
Lyra immediately recognizes that she cannot physically overpower a berserker in the real world. Their bone armor and magically enhanced strength make them virtually indestructible to physical weapons.
So her only option is to destroy the magic animating him from within the Mirrorland. She has to team up with Skuldrek, the terrifying phantom of the Ledger, to execute a metaphysical surgery.
Together, they have to literally rip the corrupted soul apart, thread by golden thread, unraveling the magic until the berserker's power collapses and the child in the real world is saved.
It's an incredibly intense metaphysical battle, and they succeed. Christian is saved. But Lyra's victory is incredibly short-lived.
Because the moment she is pulled back from the melder's trance into the burning reality of the courtyard, everything she thought she understood about her magic, her survival, and the man she loves shatters into a million pieces.
She is standing in the smoke with Amy, Roark's bone crafter cousin. And Emmy looks at her and reveals the absolute devastating truth.
Roark Ashwood is Skuldrek.
I literally gasped when I read this. It is a phenomenal, paradigm-shifting reveal. It recontextualizes every single interaction, every touch, every look they have shared throughout the entire novel.
To understand how a man can simultaneously be a mute royal guard in the real world and a shadow phantom in the Mirrorland, we have to look at the Draven Council's curse, which is a masterclass in weaponized trauma.
Let's break down exactly how a soul is physically split, because it sounds like a philosophical concept, but in Stigandra, it is an anatomical reality.
When Roark was just a boy, 12 years old, he made a naive choice that inadvertently led to the death of a Draven royal. The council demanded his execution.
But his mother pleaded for his life. So the council, in their infinite cruelty, compromised. They devised a punishment infinitely worse than a quick death. They forcefully, magically divided his consciousness.
They took a metaphorical scalpel to his psyche. The dark, brutal, violent half of his soul, his capacity for rage and murder, was literally ripped away from his core consciousness.
They named this severed half Skuldrek. And the true horror is that this dark half was then magically bound to the will of the Draven Council.
They turned half of a 12-year-old boy's soul into an enslaved assassin, a phantom sent into the Mirrorland to hunt down the lost melder and to enforce the cosmic ledger by murdering anyone who disrupted the resting souls.
which means Roark, the physical man walking around in the real world, became a trapped passenger to his own dark half's atrocities.
Oh, totally. Every single time King Demir forced Lyra to meld a bone to heal Kale or armor a guard, she was unwittingly summoning Roark's severed dark half.
She was forcing Skuldrak to manifest and commit a murder to balance the cosmic scales.
Roark, in his own mind, felt the echo of every single kill, every drop of innocent blood spilled, but his conscious mind had absolutely zero control over the Phantom's actions. Emmy uses a brilliant, highly visual metaphor to help Lyra comprehend the mechanics of this curse. She tells Lyra to imagine Roark's soul as a thick rope that was hacked in half, with the frayed ends held far apart by magical bindings.
He has lived his entire adult life as a fractured entity, half of him a prisoner to the Council's violent whims.
But then Roark met Lyra. Emmy explains that falling in love with her, forming that intense, undeniable should-11 bond, acted as a catalyst.
It created a new rope. And this new rope of love, empathy, and genuine connection was so incredibly strong that it began to strain against the Drive-In Council's curse.
It started snapping the old magical bindings one by one, slowly, painfully pulling his two fractured halves back together.
It is a moment of pure thematic brilliance by the author. She takes the common psychological phrase, battling one's inner demons, and literalizes it.
And we see this battle manifest physically. During the climax, when Skuldrak was fighting alongside Lyra in the Mirrorland against the Berserker, the dark half of the soul, fueled by centuries of rage, was trying to assert dominance. Skuldrak wanted to attack Lyra.
And what did Roark do in the real world to stop him? It blew my mind. While Lyra is in the trance, Roark realizes his dark half is turning on her. To stop the Phantom in the Mirrorland from harming the woman he loves, Roark draws his blade in the real world and physically hacks into his own chest.
He slashes his own flesh, creating agonizing physical pain to distract, weaken, and reign in Skuldrak.
He is literally, physically fighting the monster inside his own mind to protect her.
He is sacrificing his physical body to reclaim his spiritual autonomy. He is choosing the pain of becoming whole over the safety of remaining fractured.
But while Roark and Lyra are navigating this massive, earth-shattering revelation of his identity, the political reality of Stonegate collapses entirely.
King Demir's absolute obsession with controlling the arms race has blinded him. He was so focused on stockpiling berserkers that he allowed an even greater, more insidious evil to fester right under his nose.
Which brings us to the true villain's master plan, revealed in the immediate aftermath of the courtyard breach. The battle is dying down, and Baldur, one of the treacherous Stav captains who opened the gates, leads Lyra deeper into the fortress.
He brings her to an inner courtyard, and there, sprawling on the blood-slicked stone, is the architect of so much suffering. King Demir, dead.
But it is not a clean death by a sword stroke. Demir is not a casualty of the Ravager invasion. He is a victim of his own hubris, and the nature of his corpse tells a terrifying story.
The scene is nauseating. King Demir's face has been completely unrecognizably mutilated.
But the real horror is his hands and neck. His fingers have been violently melded together into a solid, useless block of white bone, and his skull has been forcefully flattened and pulled down so that his chin is literally soldered to his chest bone.
He was immobilized by his own skeleton. It is a highly specific, agonizing death by bonecraft.
And standing triumphantly over the king's twisted body is a ghost from the past.
Melder Fady. This is the king's previous melder, a man the entire kingdom believed had been brutally slaughtered over a year prior.
Yet here he stands, very much alive, and he reveals that he orchestrated the entire fall of Stonegate in collusion with Queen Aegir, Demir's own wife.
I need to unpack how Fady survived, because the body horror of his explanation is staggering.
Oh, it's so gross.
Fady explains that he used his mastery of bonecraft to fake his own death in the most stomach-churning way imaginable. He didn't just find a body double.
No, he took the corpse of an innocent man, and using the magic, he physically peeled off and fashioned the corpse's facial structure to perfectly mimic his own discarded slide-off features.
He essentially sculpted a meat mask of himself onto a dead man to fool the king's inspectors.
It is the ultimate grotesque perversion of what is fundamentally a healing craft. But Fady's survival and his ability to sculpt flesh and bone isn't the true horror of this scene.
The true horror lies in his ultimate motivation. Fady explains his philosophy. He is utterly exhausted by the servitude of the melder. He no longer wants to be an assembly line worker, endlessly melding bones into disposable soldiers for a mortal king.
Fady doesn't want to serve power. He wants to become the power. He wants to be a god.
And to become a god, he needs a specific set of bones. Fady realizes that Lyra's connection to the Mirrorland is completely unprecedented. She possesses a raw genetic strength that he lacks.
She can sense the ancient, deeply buried bones of the fallen that no one else can detect. Specifically, he is hunting for the mythical bones of the Wanderer King, the original monarch who held the power of all three crafts.
Fady theorizes that if he can find those bones and meld them into himself, he will absorb their godlike power. But he has a problem. He can't sense them. Only Lyra can.
So Fady devises a plan that escalates the biological arms race to its most terrifying extreme. He isn't planning to capture Lyra and force her to work for him.
No, he plans to physically meld Lyra's living bones directly into his own body.
He operates under the belief that by literally absorbing her skeleton into his flesh, he will cannibalize her soul's unprecedented power and steal this Jalevan bond she shares with the Mirrorland.
He wants to consume her physical architecture. It is the ultimate violation of bodily autonomy. Fady and the treacherous Queen Inger corner Lyra in the courtyard.
They have prepared a complex blood rune circle, essentially strapping her to an operating table to begin this horrific magical vivisection. Fady reaches out to grab her, to initiate the melding process that will strip her bones from her flesh.
But this is the moment the entire narrative has been building toward. This is where Lyra transforms from a pawn on the board into the queen.
She refuses to be consumed. She realizes in this critical fraction of a second that her genetics are not just a tool for healing or a curse to be hidden, they are a weapon.
And for the first time, she fully embraces the violent potential of her inheritance.
It is the most triumphant, badass moment in the text. Lyra reaches out and grabs Fady's hand first. She taps into the deep well of her magic, but she doesn't use it to heal, and she doesn't use a soul bone.
She uses the raw, aggressive power of the craft to violently meld Fady's own hand directly to his knee.
She fuses his bones together in a twisted, unbreakable knot. She takes the magic of the oppressor, the very system that has hunted her entire life, and she turns it violently against him.
Leaving the would-be god crippled, screaming on the stones as his own skeleton betrays him.
It is a profound declaration of agency. By weaponizing her trauma, she secures the brief window of chaos necessary for her and Roark to escape.
They flee the burning courtyard, leaving the kingdom of Jorvandal in absolute shambles. The invincible King Demir is dead, the queen is revealed as a traitor, the terrifying berserkers are uncontrolled, and the architect of the betrayal is screaming on the floor.
Lyra and Roark manage to escape the walls, disappearing into the wild, heading west toward the night ledges, the unfettered, lawless territory.
They have survived the collision, but the book makes a very deliberate point of reminding us that the world of Stigandra is vastly larger and infinitely more complicated than the stone walls of Stonegate.
And this brings us to the final, fascinating section of the source material provided in our deep dive today.
At the very end of the text, Andrews includes an excerpt from a connected work set within the same universe, titled The Ever-King.
It's a sudden shift in perspective, moving away from Lyra and Roark entirely to outline a short, seemingly isolated vignette. It introduces us to a young girl and an imprisoned boy belonging to a race known as the Sea Fae.
Right. It's a quiet scene that contrasts sharply with the blood and fire of Stonegate. The young girl is sitting in the damp dark outside the iron bars of the boy's cell. She is reading a fable to him from a book.
But the detail that caught my eye is that she hasn't just read the story. She's actively taken a quill and rewritten the ending. The fable is about a serpent and a songbird. In the original text, the brutal reality of nature wins out. The serpent devours the bird.
But in her rewritten version, the serpent and the bird overcome their nature, become friends, and live happily ever after. She is sitting in the dark, desperately trying to convince this imprisoned Sea Fae boy that despite the history of their peoples, they don't have to be enemies.
It is a beautiful sentiment, but Stigandra is a world that punishes naive optimism. Tragedy strikes her almost immediately.
The boy trusts her enough to hand her a delicate, ancient gold talisman, a disc that thrums with palpable magic, and he asks her to protect it for him. She promises to keep it safe.
But as she is running frantically back through the rain to her longhouse, she slips in the mud. The gold disc shatters beneath her weight.
And as it breaks, a mysterious ancient rune that was carved into the gold violently leaps from the metal and brands itself directly onto the skin of her arm, searing into her flesh and leaving a permanent magical scar.
So as a reader, you hit this excerpt and wonder, why is this here? What does this short story about a girl, a sea fae, and a broken talisman mean in the context of the massive political and biological war we just analyzed in Broken Souls and Bones?
It is included because it perfectly, succinctly encapsulates the overarching thematic resonance of the entire universe Andrews has built.
In both narratives, you have the innocent generation, Lyra, Roark, this young girl, desperately trying to rewrite the violent, blood-soaked history of their ancestors.
You have a constant thematic blurring of the lines between who society labels a monster and who society reveres as royalty. The Sea Fae are hunted and imprisoned as monsters, just as Dravenmore is viewed, just as Skuldrek is reviled.
But the true monsters are often the kings sitting on the thrones, like Demir or the Wanderer King.
And most importantly, the excerpt highlights the inescapable physical reality of the past. The history of this world literally leaves its mark on the flesh of the present.
You can't just wish away the actions of your ancestors,
Mhm.
whether it's Lyra's silver eyes marking her as a melder, Roark's severed throat marking his sacrifice, or this young girl's branded arm. The ancient magic always leaves a scar.
It is a powerful, grounding reminder that generational trauma cannot be simply erased or rewritten with a quill. You cannot ignore the history. You have to learn how to live with the scars it leaves behind and decide whether those scars will define your future or simply inform it.
And that profound realization brings us to the end of our journey today. We have traversed an incredibly brutal, unyielding landscape.
We've explored a world where magic isn't a whimsical, ethereal gift, but a heavy biological weapon forged in living bones, spilled blood, and harvested souls.
A world where the trauma of the past is quite literally, biologically stitched into the flesh of the characters trying to survive it.
And through Lyra and Roark, we've seen how love, particularly in a dark fantasy setting where survival is not guaranteed, requires infinitely more than just romantic gestures.
It requires the harrowing, agonizing task of uniting the fractured, violently opposed halves of a cursed soul. It requires looking at the absolute worst, most destructive parts of someone, looking the Skuldrek phantom directly in the red eyes, and making the conscious choice to accept them anyway.
Which is an incredible, albeit heavy, takeaway for you, the listener. Whether you are navigating the high-stakes politics of a dark fantasy novel or the complex, messy realities of real life, true intimacy requires acknowledging and accepting the darker pieces of a person's history.
It is remarkably easy to love the polished, safe surface of a person. But this Jalevan bond, that true, unbreakable connection, is forged by walking into the shadows together.
It challenges us to look beyond the simplistic binary of good and evil. It asks us to examine the cruel circumstances that forge monsters out of innocent boys, and to recognize the incredible painful strength it takes for someone to stitch their own humanity back together.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this massive deep dive into Stake and Dry, I want to leave you with a lingering, deeply unsettling question to mull over on your own.
The provocative thought to end on.
Right. Think back to that village burning in the night. Think back to Roark, a 12-year-old boy punished by a cruel council. If a person's soul is forcefully, magically divided by those in power, and their dark half is forced to commit unspeakable atrocities under someone else's command.
I think you mean under someone else's command.
Right. Under their command, when that soul is finally made whole again, when the new rope pulls them back together, do they carry the moral guilt of the monster they were forced to be? Can love, no matter how profound, truly absolve a history that is quite literally written in blood?
A profoundly difficult, haunting question to leave on.
Thank you for stepping into the Mirrorland with us today. Keep unpacking the magic, keep questioning the lore, and we will see you on the next deep dive.